Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today is March the 1st, and it's what I call a schmooze day. That is, on every Tuesday, we have one of these town hall meetings, or rather, uh, get togethers of activists here and there, and we don't know what we're going to talk about until we get together. But I can pretty well predict that today I do know what we're going to talk about because some people have called in saying they want to be on the show so that they can talk about Ukraine and the war. And it didn't take much guessing anyway to predict that that's what's on everybody's mind these days. So we have a good group of five friends who are going to each, no doubt, have some issues that they would like to get into. Martin Klein is a professor of history, emeritus at the University of Toronto, specializing in African slavery. He's writing an encyclopedia on African slavery. Olivia Ward is, I think you'd say mostly a filmmaker these days, but her main claim to fame is having been an international columnist for the Toronto Star for many, many years. And she still keeps her fingers in foreign affairs pretty well. So hello, Olivia. Erica Simpson is a professor of political science and international relations at Western University in London, Ontario. And her specialty is NATO. So I imagine she has things to tell us about the rules regarding NATO. And Alex McIsaac is the brand new chair, or whatever the title is, I'm not sure, but he is taking over for Fergus Watt, who had been the main person running the World Federalist movement of Canada for many years. So Alex is a brand new acquaintance of mine, and I'm glad to know you. And Réal Lavergne is in Ottawa, I believe, and is, I believe, the leader, whatever your title may be, of the Fair Vote Canada, right? Have I got it?
I'm former president. I'm no longer president. I was president until last June.
Oh, okay. So, but you know your way around the subject.
Oh, I definitely know my way around that subject. Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Very good, friends. So I'm going to call, I think, on Erica first.
So many issues here that we need to deal with, from the ground war, from NATO's non-involvement, from NATO's rapid reaction capability that is being deployed to France and Romania as we speak. We also need to talk about President Putin's threat to possibly go on alert, possibly use tactical nuclear weapons, and what that might imply. I also think we could talk about how realistic a nuclear attack would be in this situation and what might then therefore happen.
In Russia's previous wars, I, of course, was not in Afghanistan, Russia's Afghanistan war, that is. But in Afghanistan, in Syria, and certainly in the two Chechen wars, only one of which Putin was involved in, they were prepared to obliterate the enemy. But they have a bigger problem, as Erica and everybody else knows, they have a bigger problem with Ukraine because it's very difficult for Putin to both claim that Ukrainians are exactly the same as Russians. There's no division between them, and Ukraine doesn't really exist. It's just Russia. So it's very difficult for him to claim that, and at the same time obliterate his opponents who are, he claims, Russians, and also by heritage Christian Orthodox Russians. So that is a big problem for Putin. However, I guess the question underlying that is, how sane is Putin? Up until this point, I mean, I was definitely one of the naysayers because I followed Putin's progress and written on it for many years. And I've always contended that he's a typical, not even high-ranking KGB person who is very tactical, who will do whatever suits him and reaches his goals. But with, of course, the minimum of casualties on his side. And that's sort of the MO of the KGB and now the FSB and the security services. So I was quite astonished, actually, when he decided to go all in, full Stalin on Ukraine. Even though, as you know, we're finding out now, it wasn't as full as it might be.
Mhm.
If he wanted to actually use the forces in the most efficient way, he would do what he's done in Syria and in Chechnya, and of course, carpet bomb everything.
Okay.
And as I know very well, in Chechnya, one of my friends who is a British photographer, and in Chechnya, Steve found the remains of what was left of one of the few tall buildings, but the most accurate description of it was on the gate, one of the gates to Hiroshima. I believe it was the southern gate, which had somebody splashed red paint across it saying, "Welcome to hell."
Mm-hmm.
If I can just add, Olivia, I think the difference between this war and the Chechen war in Hiroshima is that the whole world is watching on Twitter, and we're able to see, the entire world is able to see single individuals risking their lives, seeing this 21-year-old soldier who killed himself voluntarily on the bridge trying to prevent the Russians. All these stories and narratives we couldn't see during Hiroshima until decades later, actually, and they've still been prevented from being seen. But now our hearts are being riven by these horrible pictures that young people are watching. Everyone is watching. And
Yes,
so that's the difference between this war and the Chechen and the Hiroshima attack.
well, yes, I mean, actually, people could see in Chechnya if they wanted to, because at that point there was a lot of media in there, as I well know, and so it was.
You were there.
Yeah, I was there, but also because for Russia, this was just a Muslim place that they could obliterate because they thought of these people as barbarians, and they wanted to label them all as terrorists. And if they obliterated all of them, that would be just great. It would eliminate the problem. And the same thing happened with Afghanistan in a slightly different way, and definitely in Syria, where it wanted to eliminate the enclaves of people who were opposed to Assad, and did that in the end, after a number of, I think, 14,000 casualties. They managed to do that and turn the tide. But the thing is now, even though the world may be watching, and I know it is, but whether that matters to Putin, and this goes to the issue of his actual sanity, because if he were that psychopathically sane, in a way, calculating KGB officer, that would disturb him greatly. But maybe he's gone past that point. Mm-hmm. And his big war now is the info war within Russia. He has to keep the Russian citizens from seeing that. Mm-hmm. And in some ways he can, because as Erica, you probably know, and other people on our panel, and certainly you yourself, Meta, know, that he has systematically eliminated most of the media. There's, you can watch TV dosed, but very few people have TV dosed, for instance, or care about it. And, you can have Echo Moskvy, but again, not that many people listen to Echo Moskvy, mm-hmm. and et cetera, and everything else, Novaya Gazeta continues to do sterling work. Mm-hmm. But again, people actually have to receive that.
Mm-hmm. I understand that there's a huge gap between the older Russians and young people right now. I mean, this is not a poll or anything, but it's a result of something that somebody commented on from a journalist in Moscow, that the young people get most of their news from the internet, and the old people do from television. And right. Television is, of course, controlled by the government, and is definitely biased, or if not just plane flying. And they apparently all that you see on television in Moscow, and I suppose all over the country, are shots of the war from the perspective of the people in the Donbass, who are the Russians that say they are being subjected to genocide by the Azov Battalion, this Nazi type group of people who are, there is fighting going on, and I don't know who's worse, but there is some element of that going on there. But that's all that they show, and they don't talk about the attack on Kyiv or Kharkiv.
Of course not. But the other problem that Putin is going to run into, and again, this is not something that's going to be rapid, but the same thing will happen that did happen in Chechnya, and that is that Russian mothers, Russian families will be receiving zinc coffins, because this will not be a war without casualties. And they have preemptively, before this happened, they went after, that is the Putin people with FSB and the security forces, et cetera, went after the Russian Mothers Committee, which I'm sure you know well. And they've now declared them a foreign agent, which means that they can be imprisoned at any time.
If the mothers complain that they're not happy about receiving the body parts.
Yes, that's right. Well, and the thing is, certainly in the two Chechen wars, I went along after them with mothers of Russian soldiers who were killed, and in some cases they not only received just zinc coffins after being told for months that their sons were on maneuvers, but in a number of cases they didn't contain their sons.
Yeah,
misidentified.
You know, the grounds that they would have used then, would have, in a way, had as much basis for declaring mothers as foreign agents as anybody belonging to any other quasi-protest organization, because many of them belonged to this organization called the Mothers of Soldiers. The Committee on Mothers of Soldiers, and they actually led a march, down to. It was wonderful. They marched down to Chechnya, and they said they went up to one of the colonels and said, "Your son, you've got to come home with me now," and he went.
I remember that well. That was great. But now, unfortunately, they've been ostracized and even worse, threatened, and they've been deprived of their miserable little headquarters. Mm-hmm. And of course, they'll regroup in people's apartments and things like that. But how much they can do when all news of them is cut off, and every demonstration that they try to mount will be put down with extreme prejudice. So it's really, as the war continues in Ukraine, the internal war in Russia will get worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no question.
One of the things that intrigues me is that there has been not just a Slavic, but an East European solidarity in the responses. And I wonder how much that flows into the demonstrations in Russia. The Poles, for example, who are absolutely virulent about not accepting Syrians. I mean, they're setting up soup kitchens. They're inviting people in to share their houses. The Poles are acting like the Germans did with the Syrian crisis. But it's more than Slavic, because it involves Romanians. I don't know about other groups, but there is a European solidarity that I'm interested, because when only months previously, Putin intervened in Kazakhstan to slap down demonstrations against
Mhm.
the regime. He's intervened somewhat more in the public eye in Belarus, and suddenly with Ukraine, the world's eyes are on him,
Right.
are on what he's doing.
Yes, but also in Poland, of course, there are many people with relatives just across the border, because as you probably know, of course, the histories of Poland and Ukraine are intertwined in some ways. So, and to a lesser extent in other parts of Eastern Europe. But I think also, it's unfortunate to say, but I think that racism plays a part, because Europeans generally, and particularly East Europeans, see the Ukrainians as being, even though they aren't actually members of the EU, that they're kind of Europeans. And furthermore, they themselves feel under threat, because how far will Russia go territorially? They don't know.
What do you think? I understand the Baltics, because the Baltics are small, not very populous countries, but I can't imagine Putin would ever take on Poland.
Well, if he takes on Poland, he takes on NATO. So he would take on the alliance, because Poland is his ally. I was going to mention that the Russians have already admitted to 4,500 Russian soldier deaths. So there's 4,500 mothers out there already. And the Ukrainians have only admitted to approximately just about 400. So they're hiding the stats. And then in terms of the exodus to Romania, Romania has said they will take many, which will pressure Germany to pay for so many refugees, because Germany already has so many refugees from Syria. So the picture of 500,000 refugees already in like 4 days, imagine what it's going to be like, because Ukraine has a population of 40 million people. So 7 million more than Canada. So where are all those millions of Ukrainians going to take refuge? Right now, they're welcome, but it's like in 6 months or a year, if Russia invades and tries to go to the enclave of Kaliningrad, and then it invades Lithuania, and then it attacks Poland, that's what people are really worried about, is that it escalates, the war escalates.
And everybody's promising more arms for the resistance in Ukraine. But what I don't understand, how do they plan to get those arms to them in any case? I mean, all these anti-tank missiles that are being promised, you've got to get them to Kyiv. Are they succeeding in doing that? Is there any hope of resisting?
Hungary said this morning it will not transport lethal weapons across its soil. So that means everything's going to have to go through Poland, because it won't go through the Black Sea. So how is NATO going to, and the US going to funnel $350 million worth of weapons across into Ukraine? There's a lot of promises, but the transportation network, as you're pointing out, Rial, I'm not sure how that's going to work. Alex, have you seen anything about what young people are doing, or what World Federalists are doing around the world to support Ukrainians? Have you seen any notices about weapons? Do they want to pay for weapons? What are people doing?
Well, so far, the World Federalists have been mostly concentrated on, the Security Council aspects of it. So even before, war actually broke out a few days ago, we were pushing for an open letter, mostly pinpointing 2 key points on the Uniting for Peace principle, and also the idea of that vote, which prevented any action by the United Nations Security Council in the first place, and how Article 27.3 of the UN Charter would basically make that vote illegitimate in the first place. So Article 27.3 of the UN Charter basically states that any party to a dispute has to abstain from voting on substantive matters in that sense. So one could also even have made the argument there then that the US, UK, and France should have abstained as well. So.
Oh, really? Well, but
then there would have been 6 abstentions, and it would have still passed, because then there would have been 8 votes in favor.
Exactly, and not
8
against.
votes in favor, 6, because India abstained. There were 3 abstentions. Okay, so you guys are saying then therefore Russia should not have voted. Interesting.
Yeah, and it's often something that's forgotten, right? And this is something that we were bringing through multiple projects because this keeps coming up, right? The Security Council, the P5 will always
Veto.
put their interests first and actually use the veto when they should abstain.
There's no mechanism for swatting some country down if they vote when they shouldn't. I mean, if they're supposed to abstain, if they're a party to the conflict, who's going to enforce that rule?
Nobody.
Hmm.
I can tell you from spending years covering the UN, nobody.
Well, the interesting thing is the referring of the thing to the General Assembly. And
Yeah.
the General Assembly, every country has one vote. There is no veto. And I should think that the outcome would be overwhelmingly opposed to Russia, although who knows? Do you have any sense of it, Alex?
Yeah, well, most of the international community is obviously against it. Even those that, tend to that we tend to see as support Russia tend to abstain those votes, like the UAE, India, and yeah. So
I'm
and China, of
confused
course,
about
as well.
China's position. It sounds like they're kind of trying to straddle the fence.
I was watching that that General Assembly meeting yesterday, and I was very interested in what China had to say. And I was wondering to what extent that had any influence on the so-called peace talks that have taken place over the last couple of days and actually gone nowhere so far. But what China said was, China does not want to see any escalation of this war, is basically what they said. And it said they welcome the start of talks, and they want things to be resolved at the diplomatic table, not in the field of war. So that to me was for China a very strong statement. And also something, and it made very clear China does not want to destabilize the international community. So I think, to me, that was a very strong sign that China, behind the scenes, is probably saying to Putin, just easy, just go easy. You can accomplish your goals without having to do this. Or in a worst case scenario, they'd be saying, are you out of your cotton picking mind?
And very surprising, actually, of China's reaction to all of this. I know a lot of people actually thought, this would be the time where they'd see the US as kind of busy and they'd make some moves, whether it's South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we haven't seen that so far. And I think they're just thinking of economic interests and moving away from their previous rhetoric, which was very much against a US controlled international order, which is kind of what Putin is challenging. So
if Putin gets away with it, it will establish, well, maybe not a legal precedent, but certainly it will open the path for other people to follow suit, and that China would maybe take advantage of that by attacking Taiwan at their convenience. But I'm not sure. Now, you said, Olivia, what China said in the GA.
Right.
What have they said otherwise?
In the Security Council, as you know, they abstained.
I didn't know. I wasn't sure. Okay.
Yeah, no, they abstained. They could have cast a double veto with Moscow, which is kind of what I expected they would do, because there was a lot of talk about them going closer over the weeks and even months before. And I know that they're involved in joint projects, for instance, in Central America. So I thought, right, this is, what people are saying about Taiwan. Maybe this is a partnership deal, and it'll be, first of all, Ukraine, and then it'll be Taiwan. They're also looking at what's happening in Russia in terms of economics, which is very bad.
If I were pinning my hopes for a resolution on this, on any development, it is the remarkable action of the whole economic community in the world about banking and this SWIFT banking, and the central banks are being shut down. Oh, plus the fact they're not going to let airlines into their airspace. I mean, those things will really hurt Russia.
And in fact, Met, I was thinking of you because I was thinking how, how long you've covered the progress toward democratization, but it seems that in this very short time, what Putin has accomplished is actually driving it back to some of the worst days of, well, recent worst days of the Soviet Union, where there's growing repression, and instead of being locked in by the Soviet Union itself and by Russia's edicts, people are going to be locked in because nobody will want them. So they're, it's going to be more and more isolated, and not because of the people, want to be isolated, but because the rest of the world is saying we won't.
I still know a lot of people in Russia, and I must say, Putin is not alone. There's a lot of the tendency to be to feel aggrieved and put upon, and having been disrespected, and this kind of sense of loss of status and resentment of Westerners. And I've got people resenting me and calling me an imperialist and things, because, there is a sense of we have lost our position in the world, and you guys are usurping, high status. And this kind of resentment, I really feel, is the main fuel to the whole thing. It's not about economic interests. It's not about ideology. It's only about the sense of having been downwardly mobile, if you will, in the status hierarchy. And I don't know how to overcome that. I think it's part of the reason, for the right-wing position in the US, so people supporting Trump, is mostly people who feel they've lost their dignity and they hate these elites and so on. And when that's the case, I mean, I know how to divide up money or economic interest, but when you're on a hierarchy in which you're gauging each other's status in relative terms, there's always going to be somebody at the top and somebody at the bottom, and what do you do about that? We do think they're kind of cracked. I mean, Putin is, I think, really losing it. And the attitude of resentment and truculence is very widespread, and I think is really the fuel.
I don't think you're wrong, but I think it's the cart before the horse. I mean, I think that certainly, having been there after the fall of the Soviet Union, I think the problem began there because people expected to open their arms and welcome in the rest of the world, and the world would welcome them, because that had been what happened with the dissident movements for years. But unfortunately, the West joined in stripping Russia of a lot of its treasure and helped to set up a system of oligarchy. And of course, they found, when the dust settled, that people were poor, confused, and in many cases desperate. And then they were absolutely ripe for anti-Western propaganda. And Putin stepped in, he realized that. And the stabilization of Russia, which is, presumably what brought Putin in, it's very ironic because they saw him as a stabilizer, somebody who could put an end to, the rest of provinces wanting to separate, Chechen terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. He was going to put an end to all that, and he was going to stabilize the economy, which he did, as you know, in the beginning. But then things began to go extremely bad because instead of being it's one thing to stabilize, but it's another thing to build. And he never did that. Instead, he became the sort of number one oligarch himself and joined in robbing the treasury.
Mhm.
So that was what he was doing behind the scenes. But in order to keep that in the background very much and repress it, he began a campaign of ultranationalism. And that is, I think, where a lot of this stems from, because certainly the younger people have grown up with more or less Western freedoms. They can travel anywhere. I mean, the limits on their freedom had been, I mean, up until the last while, the limits to their freedom had really been their earning power. And of course, as you know, that left a lot of people out, because especially older people and people who didn't speak any other language but Russian.
There is a concept in cosmopolitanism of 3 generations. It takes 3 generations to overcome the belief systems, the stories, and the narratives of 2 generations ago. And so the problem that we're going to see in Ukraine is the narrative that is going to come out of their nationhood now will be of self-sacrifice heroes fighting the Russians and hating the Russians. Now, it will be very hard to get rid of that. It will take 3 generations. And around the world, people will hate Russians. So I am concerned, but I'm also buoyed up by the fact that multiculturalism around the world has been demonstrated in the last few days by this huge union beyond the EU, beyond Switzerland, stretching to New Zealand, stretching to Australia, of people going, that's enough, you can't do that. And they're not going to destroy their economy, but the average Russian is going to feel the pain greatly of 20% interest rates and of a central bank of the ruble just descending in value. No more trips, as you're mentioning.
Before, Erica, before you go, the question that I wanted to ask you is fairly brief. And that is, I'm sure many people have said to you, is NATO at fault in this? Is that what's caused this horrible thing to happen in Ukraine? And what do you tell them?
I think that NATO should not have reached out and offered Ukraine partnership. I think that there should have been more discussion about neutrality, understanding Russia's geographic concerns, and that the mistake was publicly to offer Ukraine the offer of partnership, which is not the same as allyship. The allies are protected by Article 5. An attack against one of us is an attack against us all. I think the mistake was to say to Ukraine very publicly and allow the Ukrainians to continue to refer to that as if Ukraine would become part of a NATO, which will not happen in the next decades, simply because NATO decides by consensus. All 30 allies will have to agree. And so I don't think there will be consensus on Ukraine becoming a NATO ally for many, many decades. But the mistakes there too there are, of course, mistakes. And I'm not saying that I would never say that NATO acted rightly, nor would I say Putin has acted rightly. So there's mistakes on all sides, Poland sides, everywhere.
I must confess, one of the things I've thought all along is that the Americans have been engaging a kind of Cold War against Cuba, and were offended by the notion of a Soviet ally 90 miles from Miami. And while I don't like the notion of big powers dominating little countries, we, after all, live in the shadow of an elephant. It is a fact of international politics, and Russia is not what it was, but it is still one of the most powerful military regimes in the world. It has a very effective army, and I wouldn't have wanted to see a replication of 1938, but certainly what you suggested is reasonable, that there could be some form of neutralization There could have been, and there should have been. There should have been more awareness of Russian sensibilities.
Yeah, and Erica, maybe you can answer this. My understanding is that the Minsk agreement, in effect, would have created neutrality for Ukraine. Is that a fair way of putting it? I kind of think, they really should have just lived with the Minsk agreement. And this might not have happened.
Putin helped to negotiate it.
Right.
So that's why the French and the Germans are so angry. They're saying you violated the 2014 Minsk agreement. You violated it. And he also violated the democratic revolution, the 2004 Orange Revolution. He's violated international law. And that's why everyone is in agreement that he has violated international regimes and international rules. And does that mean we're returning to a world like World War II of taking territory and so on?
Yes, but excuse me, but my impression is that the main obstacle to the Minsk agreement has come from Ukraine. That Ukraine has been the main group that, has objected more to implementing the Minsk agreements than
and that's why I'm saying the mistake was to allow Ukraine to think it could be a NATO ally. And Zelensky has now said that. He's publicly said that it was shameful that they were enticed. The Ukrainians took those, Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, invited Ukrainian officials. He invited the president, he invited everyone to come to NATO headquarters as if they would become part of NATO. So that was a mistake. And I think that that's one of many, many mistakes. So you're asking me to talk about NATO mistakes, but there's obviously other countries have made many errors as well.
Well, would you say that the Minsk agreement did in effect make Ukraine a neutral country? Would have done so if adopted and implemented?
I don't know, because in the Canadian Pugwash group, we just issued a statement half an hour ago. Or actually, the International Pugwash movement just issued a statement recommending neutrality. So Sergio Duarte and Dr. Paulo Cotta-Ramusino recommended neutrality as if that's something that we could move toward now. But I don't think that we can move toward neutrality now. I think it's too late. So what you're driving at, Meta, is that the Minsk agreement should have established that Ukraine was neutral. And I'm not sure about the wording of it in that particular agreement. I'll have a look at it when we're finished. But
I've heard people say that it in effect did, but I don't know.
I don't know either.
Does anybody else know?
You know, Martin?
This group?
No. So it's not exciting reading material, the Minsk agreement. So it's moot because of the situation that we're in now. We're going to need new international arms control agreements on everything from strategic to tactical nuclear weapons. We need a new SALT. We need a new INF agreement. We need new agreements, regional agreements. We're going to need agreements about Poland, whether Poland can have nuclear weapons, which I don't think they should. Belarus has said in the last few days, a referendum, supposedly it's a military government, that they will possibly locate Russian nuclear weapons on their soil. So then Poland will brandish, it'll want nuclear weapons. So we're in a whole new world. I'm not sure returning to the Minsk Accord or agreement is going to help. If we need new agreements. And that's why I'm counting on the young people from World Federalists, which is a great organization for people to join. And if you're young, that's the place to go.
When I post this video on our website to savetheworld.ca, everybody who wants to comment or discuss this further should just watch the show and then scroll down a little bit to a comments column. And each of you can reply to anything that somebody has said to you. I'm sure we will get people commenting, and everybody's welcome to discuss this further. So be on your guard, Erica. Well, I wonder whether any of you, and Rael, that may even apply to Fair Vote Canada, have any of these organizations like World Federalists taken a position yet about what the nature of the new world order has to be. I mean, clearly we are now in a new game and new rules are going to have to be created. And what are they going to have to look like? I'm thinking more about that these days, or during the night, in the middle of the night, than I am about how the war is going on any particular square inch of Ukraine right now. What do we have to do to put the Humpty Dumpty back together again?
I think that's very difficult, particularly given the intensity of nationalist movements in various parts of the world. I think I don't think there are very many countries right now that would have a commitment to a stronger international system.
That's sad.
It's sad, but we're at a difficult moment, and I should know better, but I have this. I always hope.
Martin, don't you think that the strong world response against the aggression of Russia here is healthy and encouraging in its own right?
Oh, yes.
To me, there's an expression there that we need those international norms, that there are some things that are beyond reasonable.
I'm also, in the first stages, there was a European reluctance, Germany's commitment, need for gas, but the fact that Olaf Scholz is, after hesitating, has come on rather strong, and now granted, this pipeline that is so central to Germany's interests and it affects the cost of heating in Germany. This pipeline Germany can change its mind, and the pipeline is sitting there.
During this meeting, which continues at the General Assembly, virtually everyone who spoke on behalf of their country talked about a violation of the UN Charter and stressed that this was a kind of sacred document of the international community. So I don't think I can remember when I've seen anything quite like that.
There was a particularly eloquent speech by the Kenyan ambassador. Somebody sent me a copy of Fareed Zakaria's broadcast, which contained a large hunk of the speech, and it's nice to see something like that coming out of Africa.
Alex.
Just to go back to your earlier question, we do have a campaign for United Nations Parliamentary Assembly at World Federalist Movement Canada, which is a project that we have collaborations with other different organizations around the world on. Just recently, we had a collaboration with We the Peoples, and what we were doing is having different organizations. World Federalist Movement Canada was just one of them. To reach out to elected representatives in different countries around the world and look for, support for the creation of what we call a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. There's no defined structure for that, but it would kind of mimic the United Nations General Assembly, but have a few more hard powers, as we call them, as opposed to soft powers.
But wouldn't it also be accountable to individual voters as opposed citizens of the world, if you will, rather than to nation states?
Exactly, yeah. And of course, there would be separate elections. So there are some people that do believe that, the voting groups should still be the same as nation states, at least at the basis. Some argue that, you should distribute votes more equally because there's regional considerations and there's population considerations for different countries to weigh those votes in. So there's various differences in how people actually see the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. And that's what, World Federalists actually do. We just create these global conversations so that people can express what it means to them.
Mm.
And yeah, I wanted to also touch a bit on the point of the difficulty in actually achieving something like that, and because there's not much appetite. What we've seen is a big increase in nationalist populism, right, around the entire world, and that really undermines any like type of collaborative agreement, especially on such a massive scale around the world. But we also have to think about how change actually comes about, right? There were these massive populist movements right before like the World War I and World War II. And those led to, the only two international orders we saw that were actually universal, right? So the League of Nations and United Nations actually came out of massive war, which came out of massive populism around the world. So
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it's
Well, also
really
arms
something to
control
think about.
agreements came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they agreed to pull out their tactical nuclear weapons out of Turkey and Cuba, and there was a hotline established and so on. So in a crisis, you can, in the aftermath of a crisis, reach agreements, international agreements. So I'm pretty optimistic. I think Rael's point about how this is very interesting that the world is united to on the banking system. The world is united on condemning Russia, and also on rallies around the world, hundreds of thousands of people, and it's early days yet. So we may see something that is very positive, as you're saying, Alex, although I'm not optimistic about a UN Parliament. That idea has been around I've read so many essays on it, and it is there just doesn't seem to be a lot of will to get that going, but maybe.
But I also think that if anything will unite the world, if this is even possible, it would be climate change.
Mm.
Yes. And in fact, the most interesting efforts of most interesting international movement is on climate. I mean, Greta Thunberg's ability to mobilize, and this 15-year-old kid was able to mobilize opinion globally.
Yeah.
I mean,
But just today, the IPCC or some outfit, I can't remember, said, the states of the world are simply not rising to the challenge, that we're not getting the action that is required from governments. Yes, you may have individuals, you may have even cities doing a lot. You may have provinces and states in the U.S. like California doing a lot, but you're not getting the action from government that is necessary.
We're talking on the one hand here about evolving institutions, but what I think we're missing is the evolving or reinforcement of a certain normative structure, whether it's based around the United Nations Charter, or in Canada, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We had some very interesting discussion, which in a sense is similar to what's happening now in Ukraine. There was unanimity, or not unanimity, but a very strong majority support for ending the occupation of Ottawa. But it was done within a framework of values, human rights, mutual respect. I thought that was terrific, the way that was handled. And I think what's happening here as well is the world is coming together in opposing what's happening in Ukraine based on shared values. And I think that's really, really important. If we get this kind of reinforcement of shared values, we tend to underestimate how important those are.
Yeah. And those values are expressed in the UN Charter.
Exactly.
How much can you count on that popular revulsion against what Putin has said about nuclear weapons? Is that strong enough to mobilize people and say, well, we were counting on, quiet diplomacy to save us from nuclear war, but looks like he's rattling that particular saber now, and maybe we better have something like a TPNW that will make the difference. I'm hoping that if you're talking about good things come out of crises sometimes after they're over, well, maybe good things like strengthening the demand for adherence to nuclear disarmament could be one of the outcomes.
Yesterday on the World Federalist Movement Canada, we have a take action item. So just yesterday we posted or shared the petition by Alexandre Boulris, one of the members of parliament, who, refuses the NATO nuclear policy that's he's claiming is imposed on Canada by the US, and wants Canada to actually sign on to the TPNW. So I definitely think it's a very relevant piece of or petition right now, and it's definitely gained track since the Russian conflict.
Really? Okay. Well, I think today or whenever he just spoke to the European Parliament, Zelensky asks them to immediately admit Ukraine to the EU. Well, I think that's not going to be very likely. But what I wonder from Erica is whether that would almost automatically mean admission to NATO too.
No, and like I think first of all that they would get admitted to the EU. Someone said, a politician this morning, I think it was the head of the EU, that they would welcome the application, which is just standard diplomatic language. Of course, we would welcome your application, but I mean, Albania and Turkey, all of these countries, would Ukraine be sufficient democracy to be part of the EU? Once this war is over, they're just saying that, and it does not necessarily lead to NATO membership. So the map of EU membership is not the same as NATO membership, which is very different. Now, NATO says democracy is one of the indices, but there's no actual checklist. There's no checklist for NATO. The most important thing is a country's geostrategic location, and Ukraine is stuck being, as Martin put it, the mouse next to the elephant. And so that's going to prevent it from becoming a NATO ally, I think, for many decades. So it'll be a different world when Ukraine is accepted to NATO, especially because of the scare that we're going through now. Nobody wants to go to war, to nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine. Nobody. That would be very foolish. And so that's why NATO is holding it back, and it's not carrying out action on Ukraine territory. It's certainly the individual countries will be providing weapons, and Canada is sending all sorts of weapons now and training and so on. But we're not going to be fighting as part of a NATO force unless Russia attacks Poland or Lithuania.
Okay, but there wouldn't be any incompatibility. Some of us have said it'd be lovely for Ukraine to become a neutral state, and that's been my view all along. But could Ukraine declare itself a neutral state and be admitted to the EU? Is there any chance that they will accept him anyway? Because I don't know what's involved in becoming a member of the EU. I don't know whether anybody knows.
My understanding is it's economic, whether you're moving to the West and tilting to the West and having democratic elections. But I mean, Albania has been trying to become a member of the EU and not succeeded. And
Turkey.
Certainly, I think we could dangle Ukraine be a member of the OSCE, and the OSCE is doing things in terms of arms control and so on. I'm not sure why Zelensky issued this. I didn't understand that, and I'm not a specialist on the EU. My colleague Bruce Morrison is a specialist on the EU, and he would know the exact criteria. But for NATO, there's no exact criteria. It's nowhere written down what you exactly have to do. It's a consensus decision made by the 30 NATO allies presently to accept. So NATO went from 12 to 16, Canada's original member, and then now it's 30 members.
Well, is Ukraine not in the OSCE already? I would have thought so.
Someone Google that. I will right now.
I mean, the OSCE is a piece of cake. Everybody's in the OSCE.
Yeah. We'll find that out.
It's easy to get in the OSCE. Because all of the Soviet bloc was in it before the end of the Cold War. So I don't think any obstacles exist there.
Yeah, it's been since January 1992. So it's a fully participating state of the OSCE, which has got, as I recall, 57 members. So, and nobody's talking about they want to get into the OSCE. He's talking about getting into the EU now. He was talking about getting into NATO before. Maybe he's just doing that as a distraction technique for Putin, saying, well, look, we'll just be part of the EU and we won't ask to be part of NATO anymore. Maybe he's saying that. He knows that that's a red flag for a bull for Putin.
That kind of take them back to the pre-Maidan days? I mean, that was one of the sparks that lit that fire. It was because you had Yanukovych, who leaned toward Russia, although I think actually not quite as much as people were saying, because Yanukovych was basically a criminal and was very interested in the economic effects. However, he tended to tilt toward Russia for his own interests, and any opposition to that was to join the EU. And that was what made all these people rise up in the Maidan protests and eventually overthrow Yanukovych, because they were saying, what? We're part of Europe. We want to be part of Europe. And here's this guy who wants to drag us back to this failing state, Russia. And that was what lit the spark.
Yeah, you get an EU passport. You don't get a NATO passport. So when you're waving your passport around and you're crossing borders, it's the EU passport that allows you to do that. And so there is a desire and there will be a very strong desire for Ukrainians to leave and to travel and so on, especially if the country is devastated in war and Russia.
Right. And also, I think that Ukraine, a lot of the young people were looking to Poland and saying, hey, all these Polish guys are going over to European countries, particularly Britain, and working and getting jobs that are paying a heck of a lot better than we are. So for them, it was a matter of economics and improving their living standards. And they didn't see being close to Russia as improving their living standards or their opportunities in the world. And because, I think we all noticed that an awful lot of the people who were fighting the Maidan revolution were quite young.
Well, we've run over our time, but that's okay, because I need to edit out some stuff anyway, but it's been fascinating. And certainly this is only the beginning of what is going to be a whole new discourse for maybe the rest of our lives, many, many years, as we try to sort out what has been going on in the last few days. So I thank you all very, very much. And we'll probably get together again one of these days soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Meta.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode 417. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, look around, because we have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. And after you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is the place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.